Evolutionists frequently accuse creationists of having a view of origins that requires magic. Not only is this not true, but it turns out that it is their perspective that actually requires magic. This is because their perspective actually requires violating natural law, where the presence of an intelligent designer prevents such violations. Evolutionists will often deny this, but it is clear when you look closely at this essentially atheistic model of origins. This view of origin starts with the Big Bang, which starts at a singularity. This would literally be a point of no volume, but infinite density. What makes this magical is that there is nothing in the model about where the singularity came from or what started the expansion. It is basically a sudden expansion from nothing. Despite trying to apply the laws of physics, it still requires a magical starting point where essentially nothing suddenly expands into everything. One of the really big problems with this model is that one of its primary predictions is that the universe should be a homogeneous mixture of matter and antimatter. This is because both according to theory and observation, every time you produce a particle, you produce its equivalent antiparticle as well. They also tend to annihilate each other when they come in contact. This homogeneous mixture of matter and antimatter has two major problems. The first is that these particles would annihilate each other into a burst of gamma rays as quickly as they were formed, and any others that were formed would also be quickly annihilated. As a result, today all we would are gamma rays. The other is the fact that the universe, as we observe it, consists almost entirely of ordinary matter, with no indication of antimatter except in locations where they would have been produced by local causes. As a result, in the Big Bang cosmology, something would have magically gotten rid of all of the antimatter in a way that would not annihilate the matter. Furthermore, according to the Big Bang cosmology, the first stars could have been nothing but hydrogen, helium, and a little bit of lithium, because nothing else would have been produced by the Big Bang itself, and these stars would be needed to produce heavier elements. However, no evidence of these stars has ever been discovered, leaving no method for the formation of heavier elements, known in astronomy as metals. This essentially reduces the production of these metals to being nothing more than magic due to the lack of stars to produce them. That also brings up the issue of forming stars and planets, because in space, dust and gas clouds tend to expand rather than collapse because they are too thin for their internal gravitational attraction to be significant enough to cause a collapse. They need further magic to condense these clouds to levels where collapsing under their own gravity might be feasible. However, the only mechanism to cause the necessary shockwave are supernovas, which are exploding stars. This leaves the problem that you need to be able to collapse clouds of dust and gas to form stars before you can have supernovas to condense the clouds of dust and gas so that they can form stars and planets. Next, we get to the most magical part of the Big Bang to man story, that of the origin of life. In order to produce a living cell, you first need all of the necessary components in the same place and with a much higher degree of purity than can possibly be obtained by totally natural chemical processes as a result. Evolutionists need to magically produce all of these components with impossible degrees of purity in order to have even the remotest chance of producing a living cell. However, the magic necessary to get this first cell does not stop here. You need the right proteins and instructions to produce them, which has a probability against it. Tens of thousands of orders of magnitude greater than the number of events that possibly could have occurred in the universe since the Big Bang supposedly happened. It gets even worse when you try to assemble a cell from these components into a functioning cell. The probability against it easily exceeds 10 billion orders of magnitude. Evolutionists have no real way of overcoming the tremendous odds of getting a living cell. While they will try to suggest some sort of selection process, they had no actual mechanism. The result is that for all practical purposes, abiogenesis is just a magical process that they assume happened, simply because from their perspective it must have, because an intelligent designer is out of the question. This need for magic continues into the processes required for universal common descent to have any chance of working, despite the fact that, at least in this case, they have a process that they can claim. It is insufficient to do the job necessary to go from a single-cell organism to a human being or any other form of complex life. The notion of natural selection simply is too broad of a process to overcome the randomness of the mutations that are known to occur in DNA. Once again, the probabilities against getting what you need for the process to work exceeds the number of possible events in the history of the universe. This means that ultimately the entire process of universal common descent evolution requires a magical process to solve the problem. What makes this even more amusing is the fact that if they had a real solution to any of these problems, they should be able to demonstrate mathematically how they overcome the statistical and probabilities involved at each stage of the process. However, no such mathematical models have ever been presented, let alone demonstrated to work at solving the problems needed to overcome so-type probabilities against these events occurring. As a result, all they really have is magic resulting from a lot of imagination, with nothing demonstrating that it could actually have occurred. In conclusion, it is not creationists who invoke magic because of the presence of an intelligent designer that is capable of getting around any of the difficulties necessary in producing the world we have today. Evolutionists, on the other hand, have many cases where they essentially invoke magic, even though they deny it, to solve problems because they have hurdles that they do not have any solutions that can be demonstrated to actually work. This means despite their claims of providing a naturalistic model of origins, their model is actually magic hiding behind the natural.